She thought it was just another quiet ride to the market. But what happened next changed everything. Watch until the end to uncover the truth. And don't forget to like. The wind howled through the narrow streets, brushing snow across the sidewalks like invisible fingers arranging nature's white sheet. It was a bitter winter morning, and the city moved slowly, wrapped in scarves, thick coats, and the urgency of survival. Amid the morning hustle, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Harrison tightened her woolen shawl around her shoulders and stepped carefully out of her small apartment building. Her knees ached with every movement, but she was determined to make it to the market on her own. Independent and quietly proud, Elizabeth didn't like asking for help, even at 78. Her cane clicked softly against the frozen pavement as she made her way toward the bus stop. She was a familiar face in the neighborhood, always polite, always quiet. The young barista at the cafe she passed every morning gave her a quick wave through the window. She smiled faintly and kept walking. Inside her worn purse were just enough coins to buy vegetables and a loaf of bread. She had planned this trip with care, as she did most things, but as she reached the bus stop and saw the vehicle already waiting, her pace quickened, breath puffing visibly in the air. The driver saw her and, to his credit, waited as she climbed the steps slowly, gripping the cold metal railing. Once inside, Elizabeth realized with a jolt of frustration that she had forgotten to buy a ticket from the machine outside the stop. She fumbled in her purse, but her gloved fingers were slow. The machine inside the bus was out of order, and she sighed, clutching the coins with the intention to pay once she got off. She chose a seat by the window, out of everyone's way, and pulled her shawl tighter. The bus rumbled to life and continued on. Several stops later, a transit police officer boarded the bus. He was tall, rigid, his eyes sweeping the passengers with mechanical efficiency. Elizabeth noticed him a second too late. He began moving down the aisle, scanning and checking. When he reached her, she smiled nervously and began explaining that she had forgotten to buy her ticket but had the money and was planning to pay once she reached her stop. Her voice was soft, but the officer's expression didn't change. "That's not how it works, ma'am," he said firmly. "You're supposed to have a valid ticket before you board." "I know," Elizabeth said, embarrassed. "I was in a rush. It won't happen again." "You'll have to leave the bus," he interrupted. She blinked. "It's snowing outside. I'm only going 2 more stops. Please." "Out," he repeated. His voice carried through the bus, silencing nearby conversations. Elizabeth hesitated, gathering her things slowly. Her hands were shaken, whether from age or nerves, she wasn't sure. "Can I just—" "No." His tone sharpened. "You're obstructing the aisle. Either leave the bus or I'll escort you out." Someone in the back muttered something, but no one spoke up. Elizabeth stood unsteadily, clutching her cane. As she moved to step off, the officer abruptly reached out, grabbing her arm with a force that made her gasp. Her cane slipped, clattering to the floor. She stumbled, and before she could recover, he was guiding her, pushing her toward the door. The cold hit her like a slap as she was forced down the steps and into the snow. She nearly fell. Her thin boots slid against the icy pavement, and she had to clutch a nearby pole to stay upright. The bus doors shut behind her. It drove away. For a moment, she just stood there. Her arm ached where he had gripped it. Her pride hurt more. She looked around the street. No one offered help. A man passed by, glanced at her, then kept walking. The market wasn't far, but her legs felt like lead. She wanted to sit, but there was nowhere to do so. Back on the bus, a teenage girl who had seen everything turned to her friend and whispered, "Did you film it?" The other girl nodded silently and showed her phone screen. The video was short but clear. A transit officer forcing a frail, elderly woman out into the snow. Elizabeth eventually reached the market and completed her shopping, though the experience was a haze of stiffness and silent humiliation. She returned home exhausted, her body sore and her thoughts troubled. She told no one. Not the neighbor who helped carry her groceries up the stairs, not the pharmacist who always asked how she was feeling. She simply made herself tea, sat in her small kitchen, and stared out the window. What she didn't know was that by that evening, the video had already begun to spread. And what the transit officer didn't know, what no one on that bus could have guessed, was that Elizabeth Harrison was not just a quiet old woman. She was the mother of James Harrison, a senior official at the Pentagon, a man with a long memory, a deep respect for justice, and every tool necessary to find out exactly what had happened to his mother that day. The video, just under a minute long, began to circulate on local social media platforms by that same evening. Captured from a shaky phone camera, it showed the elderly Elizabeth Harrison being forced off the city bus by a uniformed officer. The angle wasn't perfect, but it caught the essential horror: her stumbling steps, the way she pleaded softly, the sudden tug on her arm that nearly made her fall. Most who watched it didn't know her name. They didn't know her story, but what they saw was enough. Comments flooded the original post. Unacceptable. She's someone's grandmother. What kind of training do these officers even get? By morning, local news outlets had picked it up. One morning, a show anchor described the video as deeply disturbing, while another referred to it as a chilling example of authority gone too far. Elizabeth's face was blurred in many of the broadcasts, but it didn't matter. In her neighborhood, everyone recognized her. The pharmacist who'd seen her just the day before immediately made the connection. So did the grocer. So did the young woman at the coffee shop who remembered her slow, careful steps every morning. Within 24 hours, someone from the mayor's office contacted the Department of Transit. Pressure mounted to respond. But what truly shifted the course of events came from far beyond the city. James Harrison had just returned from a security conference abroad when the video reached his inbox. The subject line was simple: "This your mother." Attached was the video and a short message from a trusted friend in federal law enforcement. James watched the footage 3 times, each time more rigidly than the last. He was not an emotional man by reputation. Within the Pentagon, he was known for his discipline, his calm under pressure, his ability to calculate strategy without being clouded by sentiment. But as he watched that transit officer shove his frail mother onto a snowy sidewalk, something inside him clenched. He didn't shout, he didn't rage, but his jaw locked, and he took action. Within hours, he compiled a full report request. He called in favors, quietly, precisely. He obtained the original footage from the Transit Authority's own security camera on the bus, which offered a far clearer view than the phone video. It confirmed everything. Elizabeth had explained herself respectfully. She hadn't resisted. The officer had overstepped, applying physical force without cause. James had no intention of making this a media event. He wasn't interested in optics. He was interested in accountability. He contacted the city's police oversight board and filed a formal complaint, backed by both video evidence and witness accounts. He reached out to legal contacts and ensured that a proper internal affairs investigation would be triggered, not buried. Simultaneously, his presence was felt in subtle ways across the city's upper levels. The mayor received a call, not from James directly, but from someone who answered when James called. The message was respectful but unmistakable. The woman in the video is the mother of a highly placed federal official. This must be reviewed at the highest level. Within days, a task force within the police department quietly began combing through officer behavior records, especially among transit patrol units. The officer in question, whose name had not yet been made public, was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. This was not routine. It was unusual. It was fast. But then again, few people in that city had connections that reached as far and as deep as James Harrison's. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained unaware of the storm gathering behind the scenes. She had no social media. She didn't watch the news often. When a neighbor mentioned that something happened on the bus and asked if she was all right, she merely nodded and said, "Yes, thank you, I'm fine." James didn't call her immediately. He knew his mother well. She wouldn't want to be the center of attention. She wouldn't have told anyone. She might even be upset that he was getting involved. But that didn't matter. What had been done to her was wrong, and he would see it made right. Back in the city, whispers began to spread. Employees in City Hall started asking who the woman in the video was. Someone who worked in transit recognized her from an old personnel record. Years ago, Elizabeth had taught his daughter. The pieces began to connect, and when one city official quietly asked, "Do we know who her family is?" the answer came in a hush that settled over the room like falling snow. "Her son is James Harrison." The words carried weight. Suddenly, the incident wasn't just a minor protocol violation, it was a crisis. The media was sniffing for deeper stories. The public wanted a name for the officer. Community leaders began asking questions. Activists pointed to this as part of a broader pattern of disrespect and mistreatment of the elderly and vulnerable. The incident had become more than an isolated moment. It was now a symbol, and at the center of it all, the one person who remained silent, who still walked the same neighborhood streets with quiet dignity, was Elizabeth. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't demand justice. She simply went on with her life. But James knew better. He knew silence did not equal peace. He knew dignity could be bruised even when no words were spoken. So he continued working behind the scenes, orchestrating consequences with surgical precision. And while the city tried to handle things quietly, trying to avoid embarrassment, it was already too late. The story was out. The world was watching. And James Harrison wasn't finished. The internal investigation unfolded with an intensity that surprised even those who had witnessed similar reviews before. Under pressure from multiple angles, the media, the mayor's office, and an increasingly agitated public, the city's Department of Police Accountability moved swiftly. The officer who had ejected Elizabeth from the bus was identified as Sergeant Ronald Blake, a veteran of the force with over 15 years of service. His personnel file was not spotless. A closer look revealed a pattern of complaints. Minor use-of-force issues swept under the rug, multiple accusations of verbal aggression toward civilians, and several informal reprimands that had never escalated to disciplinary action. This time, however, the evidence was undeniable and the public was watching. James Harrison had no interest in vengeance. He had made that clear to every official he communicated with. His goal was not to destroy careers, but to restore the dignity that had been stripped from his mother. Still, the facts could not be ignored. Sergeant Blake had violated multiple protocols: physical contact with a non-threatening civilian, failure to de-escalate a situation involving a vulnerable passenger, and conduct unbecoming of a city officer. The Oversight Board issued a statement acknowledging the breach and recommended immediate suspension pending termination. As that news reached the public, the city's temperature changed. The story became a reflection of something deeper, a conversation about respect, about how institutions treat those who cannot fight back. Elizabeth had become a symbol, not by choice, but by circumstance. Community leaders reached out to her, asking her to speak at town meetings or public hearings. She declined each invitation politely. She was not interested in microphones or speeches. In her heart, she only wanted the world to treat others with the kindness she had always tried to embody. Meanwhile, James remained in the background, working through channels both official and informal. A friend in federal media strategy offered to arrange interviews, but James refused. This wasn't about headlines. Still, the pressure created by his presence continued to ripple through city departments. Other cases of inappropriate behavior began surfacing, as if Elizabeth's case had unlocked something long buried. Citizens came forward. Former bus drivers, now retired, shared stories of being silenced after standing up to officers. Even a young woman who had filmed the original video was invited to speak on a podcast about public accountability. Amid this, Elizabeth's life began to change in unexpected ways. Neighbors who once passed her silently now greeted her with warm smiles and offers of help. The barista at the cafe insisted on giving her free coffee. At the local market, the cashier offered to carry her bags. She appreciated the kindness, but it made her uncomfortable. She hadn't asked to become a public figure. All she had done was try to take a bus to the market. One morning, as she walked slowly past the community center, she noticed a mural in progress on the side wall. It showed an elderly woman in a shawl stepping off a bus into falling snow, her head held high. The artist, a young local painter, had been inspired by the story and titled the piece "Dignity in Winter." Elizabeth stopped for a long moment, then continued on, shaking her head with a faint smile. She would never understand the fascination, but she appreciated the sentiment. Later that week, James returned to the city unannounced. He rang his mother's doorbell, holding a small paper bag with pastries from her favorite bakery. She opened the door and frowned at him. "I told you not to make a fuss." "I didn't," he said. "The city did that all by itself." They sat in the kitchen as they always did, sipping tea in silence. At one point, Elizabeth looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I did," James replied, "because no one should be treated like that, especially not you." She gave a quiet hum in response. "I'm not fragile, James, just older." "I know," he said, "but that's not an excuse for someone to hurt you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached across the table and patted his hand. "Promise me one thing," she said. "Let this be the end of it. Let people learn their lesson without us turning it into a war." James nodded, though in his heart he knew the fight wasn't over, not just for his mother, but for everyone like her, those who didn't have a son with power, those who had no one to speak for them. He would honor her request publicly, but privately he would keep pushing. The city council convened a special session to address the growing concerns around law enforcement conduct on public transit. Though Elizabeth didn't attend, her name was mentioned several times with respect. Proposals were introduced to increase de-escalation training, to install more internal surveillance systems, and to create a civilian complaint board with real power. Whether those changes would stick, no one knew for sure. But something had shifted. An old woman's dignity, once cast aside on a snowy sidewalk, had become the cornerstone of reform. and in the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, Elizabeth watched it all unfold with the same grace she had shown all her life. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded justice. But somehow, through the strength of her silence and the resolve of her son, justice had found her anyway. Winter slowly began to release its grip on the city. The snow that once blanketed the sidewalks turned to slush, and the sharp wind that had filled the streets with silence was now replaced by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of early spring activity. In the heart of the city, life continued, unchanged for most, but undeniably shifted for those who had followed Elizabeth's story. The city's reform initiatives were underway, but the deeper change was less about policy and more about perception. People remembered, and they looked at their neighbors differently. Though she never asked for it, Elizabeth had become a name that lingered in city hall meetings and council discussions. Her story was referenced in op-eds and university ethics classes. But she remained the same in her daily routine, walking slowly through her neighborhood, shopping at the corner market, sitting on her favorite bench near the library. One such afternoon she noticed something new. The bench she had always favored now bore a small plaque. She bent down to read it. To those who walk with quiet strength, in honor of Elizabeth Harrison. She stared at it for a long moment before sitting down beside it, her fingers brushing the smooth brass. She didn't want attention. She didn't need it. But the gesture was gentle, respectful, and it made her smile. A few passers-by greeted her with soft nods. One little girl approached her with a drawing and said, "My mom told me you're brave." Elizabeth accepted the drawing with warmth, her heart touched not by the praise, but by the genuine kindness behind it. James had returned to Washington. Though his duties at the Pentagon demanded his attention, his mind often drifted back to his mother and the events that had shaken their lives just weeks earlier. He had honored her wish not to pursue the matter further in the media, but he remained involved in the background, tracking the city's progress in implementing real change. He no longer saw it as an isolated event, but as a doorway to a broader mission. His respect for his mother had deepened, if such a thing was possible. She had refused anger, refused vengeance. She had moved forward with dignity, and that taught him more than any political mentor or military strategist ever had. In the community, people had begun to speak to each other more. The regulars on public transport made more room for the elderly. Drivers became more patient. Bus officers received new training, not just the usual protocol memorization, but sessions on compassion, on presence, on restraint. Some officers resisted, others welcomed it. And some, like the young recruit who had once ridden with Sergeant Blake, admitted in training, "We need this. I saw what happened to that woman, and I don't ever want to be that kind of cop." Sergeant Ronald Blake, the officer at the center of it all, was dismissed from the department. He gave one interview, carefully framed and legalistically worded, in which he acknowledged a lapse in judgment. But it was clear to the public that his apology came too late and rang too hollow. He faded from the headlines as most disgraced figures do, but the consequences of his actions echoed far louder than his words. Back in her home, Elizabeth continued her quiet life. She received letters from strangers, some from within the city, others from as far away as California and even Canada. People shared stories of their own elderly parents, or their fears of being mistreated when they grew old. They thanked her for enduring what they called an injustice. She never saw herself as a victim, not once. But she wrote back to as many as she could with short, handwritten notes that always ended the same way. Be kind. It cost nothing. Spring blossomed fully, and with it, a renewed sense of community emerged. The mural titled Dignity in Winter was completed. Its artist, a young woman named Arya, invited Elizabeth to its unveiling. A small crowd gathered, including city officials and reporters. Elizabeth stood before it, hands folded in front of her. She hadn't wanted to come, but Arya had insisted, saying the painting wasn't complete without her blessing. James flew in for the event, standing quietly at the back, blending into the crowd. When Elizabeth saw him, her eyes softened, and for a moment they shared a glance that said everything words could not. When asked to speak, she politely declined. Instead, she stepped forward, looked at the mural, herself rendered in soft grays and blues, caught in the moment of descent from the bus, but with her head held high, and simply said, "This is not about me. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching." The applause that followed was quiet, respectful, and full of something rare, understanding. That day marked a subtle shift in the city's culture. Not because of rules or laws, but because of the weight of one woman's presence, the depth of her son's quiet influence, and the collective decision of a community to be better. And as Elizabeth walked home from the ceremony, accompanied by her son, the birds singing above them and the sun beginning to set behind the buildings, she felt no bitterness, only peace. Because in the end, true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks slowly through snow, stands calmly in the face of injustice, and changes the world without ever raising its voice. Sometimes, even the quietest voices can spark real change. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share it with someone who needs to see it.